Hello dear students and viewers, welcome to my channel English Literature Today. Today we are going to study John Keats's celebrated Ode to a Nightingale. It is one of his most noblest creations. If you like the presentation today, please like and subscribe to my channel and press the bell icon. Don't forget. Now let us move ahead with our presentation. The Ode to a Nightingale is one of the noblest achievements of Keats's genius. It was inspired by the joyous song of a nightingale he had actually heard. He was one of the most prominent figures of the second generation of Romantic poets, and Keats's poems were not generally well received by critics during his lifetime. Keats's reputation as a poet grew after his death, and by the end of the 19th century he had become one of the most beloved of all English poets. Natural and intensely sensual imagery is one of the characteristic features of all his poetry. He believed in a life of sensation rather of thoughts. By way of background to this poem, let us first look at what the nightingale is. The nightingale is a small bird belonging to the thrush family. It is known for its beautiful and powerful song. The Ode to a Nightingale is a poem by John Keats written in May 1819, either in the garden of the Spaniard's Inn or, as according to Keats's friend Charles Armitage, under a plum tree in the garden of Keats's house. And this is what he had to say about the poem. And I quote, "In the spring of 1819, a nightingale had built her nest near my house. Keats felt a tranquil and continued joy in her song, and one morning he took his chair from the breakfast table to the grass plot under a plum tree, where he sat for 2 or 3 hours. When he came into the house, I perceived that he had some scraps of paper in his hands, and these he was quietly thrusting behind the brooks." Unquote. This, my dear friends and viewers, is a snapshot of the Ode to a Nightingale. An ode is a lyric poem, typically in one of the form of an address to a particular subject, written in varied or irregular meter. There are 3 kinds of odes, actually 2. One is the Pindaric ode, another is the Horatian ode, and those odes which we cannot fit are known as irregular odes. Keats used the ode form to express his strong and deep sentiments. One of the famous odes of Keats is the one which we are studying today, and that is Ode to the Nightingale. Other odes are Ode on a Grecian Urn, Ode on Indolence, Ode on Melancholy, Ode to Psyche, and Ode to a Nightingale, which were written in quick succession in the spring of 1819, while the most famous, To Autumn, was written in September, although the exact order of their composition is not known. The Ode to a Nightingale is a personal poem that describes Keats's journey into the state of negative capability. And what do you think is negative capability? So here we go. Now, negative capability was a phrase first used by the Romantic poet John Keats in 1817 to characterize the capacity of the greatest writers to pursue a vision of artistic beauty, even when it leads them into intellectual confusion and uncertainty, as opposed to a preference for philosophical certainty over artistic beauty. The tone of the poem, which we are now studying, however, rejects the optimistic pursuit of pleasure which is found within Keats's earlier poems. This poem explores the theme of nature, transience and mutability or mortality, and the latter one is one of the most particularly personal to Keats. Many of his poems explore this particular theme to its fullest extent. The poem starts with the poet in a state of uncomfortable drowsiness. Let us read the first stanza of the poem. My heart aches and a drowsy numbness pains my sense, as though of hemlock I had drunk, or emptied some dull opiate to the drains. 1 minute passed, and Lethewards had sunk. 'Tis not through envy of thy happy lot, but being too happy in thine happiness, that thou, light-winged dryad of the trees, in some melodious spot of beechen green and shadows numberless, singest of summer in full-throated ease. So we can easily understand the envy of the poet in the imagined happiness of the nightingale, which however is not responsible for his condition. Rather, it is a reaction to the happiness he has experienced through sharing in the happiness of the nightingale. The bird's happiness is conveyed to the poet by its exquisite singing. In the next stanza, Keats longs for a draught of wine, which would take him out of himself and allow him to join his existence with that of the bird. Here, dear friends and students, we are very close to the idea of negative capability. The drinking of the wine would put him in a state in which he would no longer be himself. However, wine fails to enable him to escape. He finds that his imagination will serve the function of wine just as well, and so he discards the medium of wine and embarks on an adventure on the wings of imagination. As soon as he realizes that wine is not competent enough to grant him a journey to the other world, he is in spirit lifted up above the trees and can see the moon and the stars, even though where he is physically there is only a glimmering of light. He says, already with thee tender is the night, and haply the queen moon is on her throne, clustered around by all her starry face. But here there is no light, save what from heaven is with the breezes blown through verdurous glooms and winding mossy ways. However, Keats cannot see where he right is. He cannot see what flowers are growing around him, but from their odor and from his knowledge of what flowers should be in bloom at the time, he can guess. He says, I cannot see what flowers are at my feet, nor what soft incense hangs upon the boughs, but in embalmed darkness guess each sweet, wherewith the seasonable month endows the grass, the thicket, and the fruit tree wild, white hawthorn and the pastoral eglantine, fast fading violets, covered up in leaves, and mid-May's eldest child, the coming musk rose, full of dewy wine, the murmurous haunt of flies on summer eves. In the darkness in which he is enveloped in, he listens to the nightingale. And listening to the nightingale makes him feel that it would be a rich experience to die right then, right there. And I quote, darkling, I listen, and for many a time I have been half in love with easeful death, called him soft names in many a mused rhyme, to take into the air my quiet breath. Now more than ever seems it rich to die, to seize upon the midnight with no pain. While the bird would continue to sing ecstatically, Keats imagines for himself this heavenly felicity. And he confesses that many a times he have been half in love with easeful death. The nightingale is free from the human fate of having to die, and the song of the nightingale conveys to Keats the essence of timelessness, deathlessness. The song of the nightingale that he is listening to, he imagines, was also heard in ancient times by emperor and peasant. Perhaps even Ruth, whose story is told in the Old Testament of the Bible, had heard the same story. And Keats says, "Thou wast not born for death, immortal bird. No hungry generations tread thee down. The voice I hear this passing night was heard in ancient days by emperor and clown. Perhaps the self-same song that found a path through the sad heart of Ruth, when sick for home, she stood in tears amid the alien corn." However, Keats understands that he cannot go on imagining a union with the nightingale's divine song, and he finds the word forlorn like a tolling bell. The last word of the penultimate stanza of the poem brings Keats to the concluding stanza, as it were, back to his consciousness of what he is and where he is. He cannot escape even with the help of the imagination. The movement, which started with sipping of a glass of wine, later on moving from wine to the wings of poetic imagination and then to death, stops with the word forlorn, which is the beginning word of the last stanza. The last stanza reads thus: "Forlorn, the very word is like a bell, to toll me back from thee to my sole self. Adieu, the fancy cannot cheat so well, as she is famed to do, deceiving elf." And the note of finality in the repetition of the word adieu makes him conscious of the bird's song growing fainter and fainter and finally dying away. The experience he has had seems so strange and confusing that he is not sure whether it was a vision or a daydream, and he asks, and I quote from the poem, "Was it a vision or a waking dream? Fled is that music, do I wake or sleep?" He is even uncertain whether he is asleep or awake. The nightingale described within the poem experiences a type of death, but it does not actually die. Instead, the songbird is capable of living through its song, which is a fate that humans cannot expect. The poem ends with an acceptance that pleasure cannot last and that death is an inevitable part of life. In the poem, Keats imagines the loss of the physical world and sees himself dead as a sod over which the nightingale continues to sing. The contrast between the immortal nightingale and the mortal man sitting in his garden, our poet, is made all the more acute by an effort of the imagination that the human possesses, and which, ironically, my dear friends, causes such a feeling of pain and suffering. Ode to a Nightingale describes a series of conflicts between reality and the romantic ideal of uniting with nature. To quote the words of Richard Fogel, the noted critic, the principal stress of the poem is a struggle between ideal and actual, of permanence and change, of nature and the human, of art and life, freedom and bondage, and waking and dream. The poem vibrates with personal anguish. The poet feels sad for youth that grows pale and spectre-thin and dies, as he had seen his own brother Tom, who died 5 months before the poem was written. The reference to Beauty's lustrous eyes are to those of Fanny Brawne, his beloved, and the anguish at new love that cannot pine at them beyond tomorrow refers to his own love that had been returned unrequited. Let us now attempt a comparison between Shelley's To a Skylark and Keats's Ode to a Nightingale. Like Percy Bysshe Shelley's To a Skylark, Keats's narrator too listens to a bird song, but listening to the song within Ode to a Nightingale is almost painful and similar to death. You might remember, dear friends and students, that Shelley's experience of hearing the skylark's song was one of ethereal joy. Unlike Shelley's poem, the poet in Ode to a Nightingale seeks to be with the nightingale and abandons his sense of vision in order to embrace the sound and share the darkness with the bird. As the poem ends, the trance caused by the nightingale is broken, and the narrator is left wondering if it was a real vision or a dream. Unlike Shelley's Skylark, Keats here is doubtful of the veracity of the nightingale as a symbol of his quest. With the theme of a loss of pleasure and inevitable death, the poem, according to Claude Finet, describes, and I quote, the inadequacy of the romantic escape from the world of reality to the world of ideal beauty, unquote. In other words, Keats's attempt to be united to the nightingale in its own world of abundant joy fails just because Keats's reality can never match with the ideal beauty of the nightingale's world. On a similar vein, Earl Wasserman, another celebrated critic of Keats, extends his assessment of the poem to incorporate the themes of Keats's comments on the mansion of many apartments when he says, and I quote, "The core of the poem is the search for the mystery, the unsuccessful quest for light within its darkness. And this leads only to an increasing darkness or a growing recognition of how impenetrable the mystery is to mortals." The poem we have been discussing is remarkable for the rounded felicity of expressions, which is, as Matthew Arnold remarks, truly Shakespearean. Such expressions as verdurous gloom, embalmed darkness, full-throated ease, purple-stained mouth, which we find all across the poem, show the high watermark of verbal perfection and the concretization of imagery. The deep suggestiveness of the lines, charmed magic casements opening on the foam of perilous seas in fairy lands forlorn, is truly unparalleled in the entire range of English poetry. As we read the passage, we catch a vast vista of medieval times with the shadowy enchanter's castle in a kingdom by the sea. Keats's passages are wonderful examples of perfect word paintings. The Ode to a Nightingale remains one of the most noblest achievements of Keats's poetic genius. It was one of the high watermarks of his poetic oeuvre and completely and concretely substantiates his own poetic credo. Thank you, dear viewers and students. I would love to hear your comments on the reading of the poem too. Good luck.